All right. Good afternoon, Panagiotis. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm just waiting. I think the waiting room is getting busy, and I'm seeing attendees are joining. It's a beautiful sunny day, I guess, there, and yeah, it's a bit gloomy. And yeah, so we have a very interesting topic to talk and to tap into your expertise to understand a bit more where the direction where we are heading into. We have been seeing this day in and day out with a lot of prospects. So we thought this will be the right time for us to talk a subject, especially with an SME like you, where is it the right juncture for organizations, especially like banks and fintechs, to make the change on and what are the takeaways. I mean, if they really need to tap into the revenue engine. Maybe let's
Yeah.
give a couple of moments and then we can kickstart.
Thank you, Shan. Great to be here. Let's give it a couple of minutes.
Right. I think we have it's going in. Maybe like I think maybe let's start going. We have a lot of things to
Mhm.
discuss. Can start. Yeah, Panagiotis, I would like to thank you again for joining us. And you have written extensively about banks building infrastructure, but also losing the interface. I want to start from there because I think we both agree that infrastructure investment has happened. But the question, give you some highlights of from our research. I'm sure you would have accepted this. Where do you think that we need to focus into, and what do you think it's a gap from your view today?
Thank you, Shan. I think that banking is basically not struggling with demand. I think banking is struggling with how to monetize. So you see the growth. I think you see the transactions, you see the users, you see the data. But what I think is that the revenue models that we see on the banking side, they haven't evolved at the same pace. So what's changing is not just the technology, because you're now discussing about AI and all the things happening. I think it's also, we also need to understand where the value is created and captured. And we are basically, I think we're moving from products that are sold through channels, which used to be the old model, to capabilities that we are now embedding into ecosystems. I think that has been the case for quite some time. And the reason why we have chosen to talk about this topic today is because I think APIs are basically what turns banking from a closed product into something that can be used, that can be distributed, and that can be monetized. And this is exactly the point that you are trying to make here, that that the industry doesn't really have a technology problem; it has a monetization problem, right? So, and if we look at I would say if you look at the API, so basically we are now in I call it always an API economy, right? And basically, I mean, you're the technology person, but if you are any discussion, even a business discussion, is starting from APIs and is ending with APIs, right? So, and most banks, they have APIs, right? And in many cases, I think that they have hundreds of them. But the question is, how are they using the APIs? Most of the times, I think they're using APIs for compliance. Let's say open banking, I think is probably a very good example in markets where you do have this compulsory open banking. And then they're using this for internal efficiency, but they are not using it as revenue products. So you have a capability, but it's not treated as something that you price, that you package, and that you sell. And I think this is here the discussion point for us. So, and also this is here when it comes to AI. Do
Yeah,
you, do you-
I think you framed it so well. APIs were built for compliance and not for commerce, right? And that's where the junctions here. And pretty much on the along the same lines, AI is being deployed purely at a cost center perspective and not as a revenue center, right? That's where the view is. And also when to touch upon your point on open banking, right? Yes, open banking was more like a regulation where the investment was forced for people to come up to start avoiding, but it's always framed as a cost obligation, right? It was never been framed as a model where how you want to come up with monetization. In my view, the structural problem is banks own the data, but not the decision, right? That's the way I look at things. But yeah, see, again, also you talked about, see, you always argued about risk becoming a silent infrastructure, right? So in my view, also banks are always becoming a silent infrastructure behind someone else's margin, right? So if
Mhm.
until they come up or they think about the leadership teams have actually internalized to have a very clear monetization strategy, other than it's just an endpoint sitting somewhere for someone to like understand it's there, right? Again, also to think along the same lines, right? Where do you think the shift should happen, right? Is it, in my view, do you think the shift is from access to action to revenue, or what is the shift we are describing here?
I think what you have seen over this is actually a very good point. But before we go to the shift, I think that over the past years we have seen banks investing heavily in modernization, be it cloud, be it APIs, and the focus was always how do we build this. So now I think the focus should shift. How do we make money out of this? Right? And that's for me the gap. So the gap in terms. So before we go to the shift, the gap is okay. What's missing is packaging the capabilities that they've built into products, embedding them into real use cases, and pricing them not based on value and not based on cost. Because what we normally see is that they say this is how much it costs us. Okay, let's price it based on the cost side. So and this is the wrong way how you price your capabilities. You need to price them based on value. So the shift is I would say if so the question is the following: if the problem is the monetization, and I think we agree on that, the question is what is actually changing in the model. And I think the answer to your question and when it comes to the shift is the changes. So it's how banks operate and where value sits in this shift. Um, so I would say that the APIs, the why the APIs they make a difference, if we need to analyze this a bit more, is because they expose the capabilities. So if you see the model today, so banks they are not packaging the products end to end. So the APIs, they're basically allowing them, enabling them to expose the individual capabilities. So for example, on the payment side, identity, on the lending side, on the data side, and these capabilities, they become building blocks through the APIs. And this is how you can use them because now banking is in many ways not still sitting within the bank, but is also sitting outside the bank inside the platforms, the journeys with partners, etc., the third-party providers. And if you have this capability of being able to use all these things that we mentioned as building blocks, it means that you can also use them as part of this embedded finance landscape, which was not the case before. And so for me, this is the API piece, and we can maybe now discuss where the AI piece comes in, right? So I think the AI piece now has to do with as you very well have put on the slide, with the decisioning piece. So once you do have the capabilities, right? The question is, which one should I use? When? And what should be the conditions that are triggering this? And I think this is the important thing now with the AIs, because AI is exactly the layer that will be it will be a decision layer effectively. It's not going to be a tool, but it will be determining, for example, the the timing element. So when exactly the risk element, what would be the routing in real time? So that's for me the combination of APIs on the one hand side and AI emerging as a decision-making layer. That's what we see out on the market. Not sure if you agree.
Yes, see what you are describing is shift is just isn't technical, right? It's a business model. That's what we're talking here. And also we are talking about from charging to connectivity to capturing the value, right? At the point of decision. That's what you're explaining here. Let me also break down this what actually means in practice, right? What we see when we work with banks and prospects, right? See, again, we call it as three layer approach, what we always do. Layer one, as you rightly said, is API, right? That's the foundation we are talking. API must become products and not integration layer. I think that is where the banks or the fintechs have to think. And a classic example you talked about, a payment API as a product, right? A credit scoring API is a product. Do not look at that as an integration, which is making you talk to a credit decisioning application behind the scene. No, right? The identity verification. So there are, as you said, start having that mindset where you're talking about a product first approach and not about how you bring the API. And the layer two, again, the right shift we are talking about. AI is not, and it is has to be treated as an orchestration layer, right, and not as an application. So that's where you build the rail, and that's where you really like power the whole journey, because you got the layer one right, which is your API foundation layer, and you are actually building an orchestration on top, which is the AI. I think when these two layers have been fundamental,
Mhm.
right, layer three is nothing but your revenue actually shifts from access to usage, right? That's the way we have pulled out, and that's what we have actually seen very evidently in the last 6 to 9 months. But I would like to hear from you. Do you agree, or do you see this
Yes.
is the approach which any organization should take? Again, these are not a well-written theory. These are basically practical approach what we see where people fail and what people really need to be quick on the toes to come back and fix it. What's your view, Panagiotis, here?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. The thing that you mentioned that the revenue comes now from usage and not access. I think this is the key point now, and this is what people and banks they need to understand. So if you look at the old model, value came from owning the product and the customer relationship. And now you have a model whereby you have value coming from how often and how effectively your capabilities are used. So it's not about selling the access, but it's about driving volume and embedding this into flows. And in many cases, these flows are not your own flows. So you need to be able to play the game where the client is and where the game is actually happening. So that's the big change. So um, I mean, the reason why the value now is moving to the decision-making layer is because if you look at what's happening is that the core, the product, the balance sheet is becoming commodity. And the question is, how do you differentiate? So AI is now the decision-making layer that is helping you to differentiate, but many people they don't understand that the APIs they are still the basis for this to happen. I hear a lot of times that now we have AI, we're not gonna need APIs. If you don't have APIs, you're not gonna be able to use AI effectively. I think that should be a key message that needs to come across.
Yeah, maybe I want to ask you a general question because you've been pretty well known in the region, right? So now that we are covered about AI and API native banking concept at length, how many banks do you think in Europe are genuinely operating on this three layer of approach what we're talking today? Capability, intelligence, and revenue, yes, but are we just making that happen, or are we just talking about it? What is your quick take on that, especially in the region we operate today?
I think we're still we talk about it a lot, and that's a good thing because at least it shows that there is an acknowledgement, right? But I think as you have pointed out, we need to do more on the execution side. And on the execution side, many times I think you're starting from the wrong foot, right? So you need to start from the basis. You need to start from the data. You need to start from the cloud. You need to start from the APIs. And once you have those in place, you need to go to AI and how you coordinate all of that. And I see quite often that we have a discussion that is starting from the end, is starting from the use cases, is starting from the AI, and says, okay, now because everyone is talking about this, this is what we need to employ. But when you look at the basis, when you look at the capabilities, in many cases, these organizations, they have not been paying, I would say, a lot of attention to the basics. And now the basics, they become a key enabler. So if the basics are not there in a way that makes sense, in an efficient way, then the outcome is not going to be the outcome that you think uh, it should be, the one that you are expecting. So this is why, and this is exactly the thing, today's discussion is important because we need to explain in a very practical way what it means and how the organizations can actually employ, and the banks, they can actually employ these capabilities because they have the capabilities. They just need to use the right tools. They just need to use the right setup so that they can expose them in a way that the market can understand.
Yeah, thank you for that honest view on how things have been looked upon. Yeah, now the next segue we are talking about where revenue is created, right? That's where we want to head because we've been talking about this for quite some time. And what we need to also make it happen is let's get to the specifics, right? Because API monetization is a phrase gets thrown a lot. I
Mhm.
want Anchor to have very concrete revenue pools of what we are talking today in industry. I would like to just give my view of what we see as revenue pools, which at least in the industry we currently operate. And I would like to get your insights there because we always, when we talk about AI, we always talk about, at least in my view, the first revenue pool we talk about is transaction volume getting generated by AI, right? That's a big dimension which we are looking at. And we're also talking about conversion uplift it, right? So because now we are talking about everything, we want to have a yardstick on how we measure. So how we conversion uplift and how are we making better decisions, right? That's also a revenue pool because most of the time we talk about middle office and
Mm.
operations. How is that happening? And the third one is a classic. I'm sure you would love. That's your topic: distribution through embedded finance, right? Because now
Yeah.
that's been thrown away everywhere. So in our view, we were thinking these are the three at least core revenue pools what we look at on how the platforms are catering today. And I would definitely like to get your thoughts. And do you think, or do you also agree that these are pools that we need to focus purely from a financial services industry, or do you have any other thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. So we need to look at the transaction volume is the base layer, right? So, and then you have the conversion, right? So it's where AI comes in, and then it's how much of this volume you can capture, right? So, and the decision-making process that the AI is enabling, I think is key here. And then, of course, distribution. So who is actually controlling access to the customer is key. And then you have, as a next layer, you have the APIs and the AI that we explained before, meaning that you're able to generate, to produce revenue at every transaction. So it's not that you have revenue tied to a single product or to a single moment, but it can happen continuously across the journey. So whenever you have, for example, a payment, whenever you have financing, whenever you have a transaction, so every interaction becomes a potential monetization point, and it's not only the final transaction. So I think basically what we see is that the revenue does not move away from all these levers and layers that we have been mentioning, but it becomes more, I would say, distributed is the right word, and decision driven and embedded into the flows. And maybe it makes sense before we go and analyze this workflow that we have here. Maybe we can talk a bit, and I think that's the previous slide. We can talk a bit in general about the use cases. So I think um, exactly. So, for example, I say, so beyond the credit decisions, maybe before we analyze, maybe we explain what is the real difference. So, what was traditionally the case when you had the static scorecards, the limited data, the slow decision-making process, versus what APIs bring today to the table, and how AI is also becoming a key differentiator as part of the process.
Yeah. I think yes. See, what I also would want to understand, because I've also seen one of the things which you have written about, right? How do someone move up the digital value chain, right? It all boils down to that, by the way, right? In that way, again, we will touch back again on that because we went on to the revenue pools, right? What do you
Mhm.
think is underexploited right now? Which area do you think has to? Because when we talk about horizontally about how do we drive up the digital value chain, there are still, I feel, at least in my view, have a lot of underexploited areas right now. Which one do you think is the hardest for a traditional bank to actually capture?
Mhm. I would say it depends, but the ones that are key, I would say the first one is the credit decision making, and this is also why you have been focusing on this. So that's for me the first one. Another one that is not very uh, attractive, but it's sitting at the core, is the fraud detection. Um, I think, San, can you? Okay, I'm gonna continue. I think we're gonna have San back. Okay, now you're back. Can you hear
Yep.
us? Can you see us?
Yes.
Okay. I was just saying that I was just focusing on the credit decision use case, and I was just saying that this is one of the key elements. And then fraud is another one that is very important because fraud has always been there, right? And there was a trade-off always security versus conversion. But with APIs and AI, what you can do is that you can access risk in real time using more data, more signals, and this has a real impact on the bottom line. And the another one I would say is what we have been discussing from the beginning here on this webinar is the embedded finance, right? So this is where the APIs are most visible. So because the distribution now is not with banks but is with platforms, the question is how can banks become embedded into the platforms? And it's exactly being able to use the capabilities to embed APIs basically to embed your capabilities in the platforms. So I would say for me, this is a very underutilized use case and scenario from the banks. I think they can do much more on this one. And again, now with payments becoming real time, right, and not batch based as they used to be in the past, I think APIs enable access to those rails, and then you can have AI deciding on top of the instant rails what is the routing, what is the timing, what is the cost element versus the trade-off, and based on this, I would say criteria it makes automatically a decision that is an ideal decision. So I think all these use cases, I think all these areas should be areas of focus. If you ask me for banks nowadays. So Sam, if you agree, maybe now we can go and explain a bit the flow because we have exactly. So we have basically prepared the scenario so that we explain step by step how this works and what are the practical implications.
Am I audible? Panagiotis, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We've lost I think, the slide, but that's fine. Um, I think we can start working on this as you are trying to put it back onto the screen. I can maybe provide an overview.
Yes,
Uh,
please.
so I would say the reason why you have chosen this use case and why it makes sense to explain is that credit is one of the biggest revenue drivers in banking, right? So what APIs and AI change here is the speed, the accuracy, and the scale of the decisioning. And this is why this has an impact onto a direct impact onto the bottom line. So maybe you can start here from we can go step by step. I'll let you lead this one, Son, and then I can also pitch in as you are describing the steps.
Yeah, I think yeah, this maybe I will talk about how the API foundation gets powered here,
Yeah.
especially when, see again, I always keep that APIs without. a marketplace, our infrastructure and APIs with marketplace is a business, right? That's a very famous quote which we've been talking about. So we start from there. See, for example, today when a lot of people think APIs always end up in running in a gateway, right? And if that's true, it's much easier for us to, like, you know what, either discover it, document it, catalog it, and then comes the use case and product building and everything, right? So we always, as a platform, when every time we work with a prospect, we ensure that how we identify every single foundation API asset running in the organization purely either by business verticals or by horizontally. And then the second thing is about how ease someone can come and understand what you're offering, and how ease someone can come and understand also to discover what's been there. So that's what, if the structure you see, it's pretty straightforward structure. So you have a
Mm-hmm.
runtime coming in, you have logging coming into the equation, and then of course there is also the auth model and consent is basically started as more tech stuff, but it's again now the functional layer which defines it. We talk a lot of things, especially DCR and other things coming into the equation. And then we also talk about how do you ensure that we have a robust governance built, because these days things are moved away from self-assisted to self-service. So we want to ensure governance is not an afterthought; it's actually baked as part of the platform itself. And then, a lot of organizations not very comfortable allowing you to, like, actually talk into their ecosystem. So they always believe in having a well a well transactional sandbox capability which comes in, so that, you know what, if I need to really understand, not necessarily I need to read a document. If I'm tech, I can quickly understand what this capability is all about. And then devil is always in the details. How do I actually bring a clear dashboarding which talks about every dimension of analytics, right? This is what, as a platform, which is expected for you to have technically ready. But
Mm-hmm.
then start is from a functional angle, right? I know this is just 30% of the story, right? How does it functionally get encapsulated when you actually come up with this whole journey of accreditation, especially, right, when on paper dropping days, things are a bit very laborious, but now we are pretty quick in many angles. So I would like to actually understand from you, how does
Mm-hmm.
this change in tech have a momentum change in how things have been happening on the functional side?
I would say the best way to understand this, if we look at the steps here that we have, then you're going to understand also the impact. So, and for me, it's always comparing what used to be the case before with what we do today, and then understanding what is the kind of gap that we managed to close. So, if we take, for example, let's say we take the first step, which is the consent, right? So, you have, instead of relying on static bureau data, right, because that used to be the case, you now get, I don't know, 6, 10, 20, whatever months of real transaction data. And it's a fundamental shift because you go from a snapshot point of view to continuous financial behavior. So that's point number one. It's key. So you have a pull instead of a push, and then you normalize the data that are passed by the APIs. Because many times, as you have already seen, I think, and this is also part of the added value that your guys offering, is that many times the raw transaction data is messy, and they don't have a structure. So you need to understand what is the income, what is income, what is expense, what is the cash flow, and APIs, they make this scalable and repeatable, not manual, right? So that's the second step. And then you have the API, right, that they score behavior in real time. So instead of having very simple rules or simplistic rules, AI is basically looking at patterns. So how stable is the income? What is the spending behavior? What is the repayment capacity? And this is allowing effectively what we call in banking this granular risk assessment. And commercially, this has a very direct bottom line because it means that you can approve more customers without taking on disproportionate risk. And this is key. And then, as a continuation, if you go to the next one, it's the decision layer. And this is, for me, the biggest visible change because you have the decision-making process happening in seconds, literally, and not in days. If you look at the decision-making process of putting all these static things together in the past, it used to take days at the best case scenario. And now it takes seconds because they all happen in real time. So you don't have any bureau calls, you don't have any manual underwriting. And this has a direct impact on the conversion, right? So on the front end, but also on the operational side, on the cost side. So the actual cost of the bank to do all of this stuff is much, much smaller because you are not employing employees, you're not having these manual processes sitting behind. Uh, and then I think it's very important to explain how the API portal is an enabler of all this, as you have been describing before, because the API portal is the thing that discovers and brings the data sources together, manages the consent and the access, and is also the one that is scaling the usage, right? So, and this is exactly the difference between having a use case and between having a use case that can be used again and again and become monetizable. Not sure if you have anything to add, but that's for me in a nutshell how all these things they come together and where the added value really sits.
Right. I think I really liked the point which you highlighted, right? See, everything we spoke is basically it's a combination of steps you're talking, right? How tech comes in, how the process gets embedded, and then how do we make this happen, right? Do you think, again, it's maybe slightly off topic, do you think bank invest in every step and every process to make this coming as one umbrella? See, right, as you said, platform is actually a very important thing, right? And then comes the process, and then as you said, we're not taking about number of days to make addition. We are talking about seconds to make addition, right? So there is have to be the right investment. It's just about tech. It's about the people. It's getting coming together. Do you think, in your view, the banks do invest in every level to make this come as complete? Or do you still feel there is some places where you, at least in your view, you think, no, the investment has to be increased to make this happen?
I think that we need to see, so as you said, technology is the one side of the equation, and then the business and the process is the other one. And I think we don't have a lot of realization, or it's not as high as it should be, on the effort that we need to put on changing the decision-making process. And the process is basically behind this technology. And I'll give you a very, I would say, vivid example. So imagine all the committees that you have at banks around decision making, around credit, around approving all kinds of lending. Now, these are slow moving, I would say, process intensive uh, um, committees, and basically they are not, I would say, appropriate if you want to have a real-time decision-making process. So you need to look at the structures that you're basically having today, and you need to say, okay, this is the technology I have now. We have APIs, real-time. We are talking about instant payments, as I mentioned before. We are now having API as an orchestration layer. So this is not compatible with the old setup and the old structure. So the decision-making process needs to change. And most of the times, I would say this is the biggest blocker within the organization, because that means changing not the technology side, but the way that people are working, and that the way that very, I would say, long established processes have been set up in the first place. And we all know that resistance to change is very significant in these cases. So that's something that needs to happen. But I'm very much of the opinion that this is where banks are going to see a lot of the added value. So these things, technology and the setup and the operational setup, they need to work together. They go hand in hand. If one is not there, the other one cannot be as efficient as it could and as it should. If both of them are um, progressing in parallel, this is where you see the actual added value.
Right. See, that's where, because the why I asked you this question is, right, when we talk to most of the financial prospects and clients, right, this is how, as a platform, how we actually come in very handy, right? Because we have gone through the journey, we have worked with many large banks in the world, we have worked with large insurers in the world. The structural problem what we see is not about not having the right asset, not having the right products in place. It's about how do you bundle it, how do you make it available for someone to consume it, and how easy you make someone adopt it, right? And
Mm.
that's what we have pretty much have done. Like, for example, banks do have a lot of fantastic products, but then how do you make it visible? How do you make it available? How do you make someone understand this quickly and easy for them to move on, right? Today, I think that's where things have happened because in the past, when I used to work for a corporate bank, they keep telling me onboarding a client is basically a ceremony, right? It's a 3 to 6 months process. Now we talk about like
Mm.
dynamic onboarding, right? If you want, and again, depends on the size, depends on the customer, depends on the location. But do we have a platform to cater that, right? And once you bring them on board, how do you keep that stickiness, right? Now there's the lines are becoming thinner and thinner and thinner where we talk between wealth, private, retail, and corporate when it comes to tech-enabled business, right? We gone those days where we have that umbrella where corporate banking investment, we don't go there, but retail is something which is very easy. Now the line is actually thinner and thinner because the platforms like us really make that line much thinner. And also we now enable agnostic of which business vertical in a bank you belong to. You have a ruder set of products, we can bring you on board and make it happen. Of course, I'm not going into the details, but yes, we just want to tell you that if there is something you really want to bring it onto the platform, there are not many players as what we do for a prospect because when the prospect comes to us, they have 30-40% of visibility what they ask us, but then we also have to guide them saying how in our own experience see how we can take them along with different things. That's one point I want to highlight. Let's also talk about there's another important point which I also would like to talk to you about is what should be the mindset, right? Again, in your view it also seemed right when APIs are owned by the compliance team, right? Usually that's what we think. They're designed for auditability, not usability. That's my view, right? I'm happy to be wrong. Because what happens whenever we look into those aspects, we don't see a proper documentation what brings on board, and that's a first no. That's a first no for someone to understand what you're offering. Again, as I talked about onboarding, be the moment you make onboarding painful and not easy for someone to adopt, that's where the second challenge comes in. The other view also I want to ask you is see AI as a feature, right? And again, somehow if you do not embed that as part of your customer journey, AI goes missing, right? Because that disconnects everything what you're talking. Because most of the AI pilots in banks are almost like universally internal, right? I'm still not seen a bank who comes and tells me, you know what? We have actually implemented AI in our production ecosystem, and this is what it's done today, right?
Mm.
I would just like to understand because you work with a lot of banks in your current capacity, is it still going to be universally internal or of course you can argue with me saying AML transaction screening and few other things, yes, AI is used in that stage, but when are we going to see bigger scheme of things where AI will change, and how do you think this compliance mindset of external integration has to actually be looked upon in the coming years?
I think it's two things. So the first one is if you look at what banks have been doing over the past years, they have been using AI, but they have been using, the traditional, I would say, branch of AI. And now we are talking about generative AI, right? So the difference is that now banks are focusing on that. But this one, again, it goes back to the discussion that we had before. It goes back to the capabilities. It goes back to how they are set up. It goes back to how well data is structured. Are they using the cloud? How well the organization is set up for this? So for me, we need to go one step back and we need to understand, uh, for example, going back to the APIs in the discussion. So most banks, they already have the APIs. But if you ask, how many APIs do you have? If they don't have a marketplace, if you don't have the setup that players like you are offering, they're not able to answer. So no one knows really what exists internally. And this creates duplication, slows down the use cases. So how can you, for example, make efficient use of AI if you don't know how many APIs you're having internally? And you mentioned here, for example, the catalog, right? So if you have a central catalog, it means that you have internal teams and partners, they can find and they can reuse these capabilities quickly. If you don't have the structure, no one knows where these capabilities are sitting. And of course, if we then talk about AI and about implementing AI without understanding what capabilities we have, how can we build a use case that is effective? So that's why I always say we need to go back, we need to manage the existing capabilities, we need to make sure that we are producing more revenue per asset, And we need to make sure that we expose these capabilities as AIs externally, but to do that, you need governance. So you need to have control. And that's why you say, for example, govern and secure, and then you manage and monitor. So you need to understand who has access to what. What are the conditions? So why, for example, Sun should have access to A, B, C, and me, I should have access only to A. And what is the, you need to be able to audit that. And this is the only way you can scale, right? Because we are now discussing about, I would say, credit payments, embedded finance, but it only can scale if you can, I would say, have an efficient operational setup. Otherwise, you cannot generate revenue out of this. So all the pieces that you are mentioning here are for me key in order to be able, first of all, to scale, second of all, to expose your capabilities, and third of all, to make use of AI. I don't think that that we are able to discuss about AI unless we do our homework and make sure that we really have those things in place. Otherwise, AI without the capabilities is like an empty book. So you have the book, but within the book, the pages are basically empty.
Yeah, that's a very, very good summary because it's easy for us to talk about what the platform will bring, but especially if you look from a consumer angle, you know what the platform really brings and what's the value it has. In the interest of time, I would like to actually ask you one thing for this audience. What does the winning formula looks like? I know it's not one common formula, Panagiotis, but you've been working on this, right? So I would want to actually end this conversation like with a winning. What does the winning model actually look like? Because I don't think it requires a complete transformation, right? Because that's like boiling the ocean. In my view, there are very specific organizational and architectural transformations, or the decisions can actually make this happen, right? And again, one, we talk about a well-governed marketplace. Yes, changes everything about the commercial model. That's the first tapping stone of what you talk as revenue or an API revenue, which you put as a model. The second one I would like to understand from AI must sit at the point of decision, not at the point of reporting, right? I think that's the second biggest thing what we also see. Third one, we again what we have seen working with a lot of partners in the industry is distribution through partners beats distribution through branches, right? I think these
Mhm.
are what we see because now the more and more of the tech enablement is really coming into the forefront. We see this shift happening. Do you also see in the industry that this shift is happening? And what would are the three takes which you would want to advise to the audience here? This is what are the
Mhm.
changes make that impact.
Uh, I think this is probably the best question to finish the discussion, right? So I would say, going back to the winning formula, as we always say, it's about execution. But what does execution mean in this case? So the first of all is, again, as we discussed, you need to expose the capabilities through the APIs. So you need to treat the payments, lending, data, identity as products that others can use. So these are not internal functions. So if you're not able to give them to partners to consume externally, they won't scale. So this is the capability side. And then you have the decision making side, and this is AI. So you need to compete on how decisions are made on the pricing side, on the risk side, on the routing side, on the timing side. And this is basically where you have your margins. This is not the infrastructure. So the margins are made exactly on the decision making level. The third one is the distribution. And we always say that this is key. You cannot wait today for customers to come to you, to your channel. You need to go to them. How do you go to them? You embed in platforms, in workflows, in ecosystems, and you actually go where transactions are happening. And once you do that, you need to monetize. And you need, and it goes back to what you have been mentioning before. You need to monetize the usage, not the ownerships. So you need to shift from selling products to kind of benefiting from the activity. Wherever you have a transaction, whenever you have a decision, whenever you have an API call, you need to be able to monetize based on those. So in this case, it's not important who is the owner, but it's important if you can monetize based on the volume and based on the frequency. And once you're able to do that, so once you are able to build those things once, then you need to be able to do this repeatedly. And this is what we call scale. So I think these are, for me, the trends that I see. This is the winning formula. It's not rocket science, but on the other hand, it's also not something that you can do from one day to the other if you have not done your homework. And that's why I think we have tried to explain today why APIs matter, what they mean in practice, how do they connect to AI, and what it takes to get there.
Fantastic. I have one last question for you before I let you go. In 5 years, do you think the banks will win, will be the banks which will actually be the ones who build better products, or banks which build better platforms using other products? Is this the distinction banks are ready to actually make today? What's your view?
I think it's going to be a mix. I don't think we can say that you're going to have one model or the other, but what we can certainly say is that if you are not able to compete on both sides, then you are probably losing a good part of the market. And I think so far what we have seen is that banks have been mostly competing on the product side, and they have not been benefiting from exposing again their capabilities onto the outside world. So they need to do this more. Does that mean that we're going to have to see only the banks able to play on the platform model? No, because you're going to have also other models, but they need to increasingly embed their capabilities into the wider economy. So I think they need to start doing things that they were not doing before, and they need to be open to new business models because this is also where the industry is going. So I don't think there is a black or white answer, but they need to increasingly do things that they were not used to doing in the past, and they need to understand how they can do these things. And part of the discussion today is exactly that. How can you do these things?
Yeah, there is no one success formula for everything, but yes, there is. It has to be more like an hybrid version, what you say in our language. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we have actually given something for the audience to take it back. It's at least it's not just about platform and tech capability. It's about how do you blend the business success is always when the tech and actually business comes together and how the model gets built. And it's really it's also very refreshing to hear from someone who's been on both sides, and also to listen, because we as tech always look in one lens from a tech, but now I think the last 1 year, because of AI, we started looking in all 360-degree, by the way. And definitely looking forward to having more such conversation with you, Panagiotis. Thank you so much again. And thanks everyone for joining us for the sessions today. I hope we have actually given you something useful. Feel free to post any questions you have in the chat, or you can always write to us, and we are happy to take those questions and get back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you all. Great discussion. Thank you.